Hey, good evening, and welcome to the Black Ibis Social Club late night evening edition. I don't expect a lot of people to join us tonight, but we'll see how that goes. It's kind of dark and spooky in here because everybody's just already went to bed in my house. Now, we're not doing a regular episode because I'll be honest with you guys, I overestimated our capability to do weekly episodes during Lent. For you guys that are Orthodox Christians or Roman Catholics, but specifically Orthodox Christians, we have a lot of liturgies, Vespers, and Complines, and all the different services throughout the week. And it just happens to be an exceptionally busy time in my regular work. So between work, obligations with church, my daughter's school obligations, her dance classes, and everything, I'm just completely overwhelmed. And unfortunately, I don't have the time to really put down really good episodes uh, until probably after March. Most of all, I don't want to invite guests over and have nothing prepared, have no good interview questions, not be able to do the research. That's not fair to listeners. That's not fair to the guest. So next 2 weeks, I'm slammed. I'm only gonna do little mini episodes until Fisto and I return. But I was thinking about today, and what I want to talk about the novel, fiction, and the books, and like books and culture, right? And so the novel, fiction, books, and culture, all different things that are all kind of tied. I'm gonna type it real fast in the chat to see if you guys see it. I'm just trying to see if my chat's working. All right. So if you there's something in the air recently. I don't know if it's the whole Middle East war in Iran thing, but there's a kind of a malaise going on. And I don't know if I'm the only one that's seeing this or only one that's feeling it. And by what I mean kind of a malaise is that I I don't really have much interest in anything. I'm not really excited about reading any books or watching any movies. There's nothing to watch. There's no TV shows except for one I'll talk about later. But I don't even want to go on Substack half the time. I open it and I'm just like, politics stuff, same old stuff, same old stuff. And there seems to be like a kind of a disconnect from the greater e culture. Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's not. I don't know. But one thing I've noticed, and it's kind of caught my attention, is that there's a increase in conversations about books. And I don't mean like we're talking about books that we've read. We're talking about what's going on with the novel. Is the novel dead? Is the entire infrastructure around publishing dead? Is it completely useless? Is the culture of reading done? And there was an interesting little miniature article by Sam Kahn, and Sam Kahn was a guest on the show 2 years ago when I first started. A good episode if you go back to that. And he uh, he kind of outlined a few points in the publishing industry, but one of them kind of stood out to me, which was publishing is really slow. Right? It takes about, and we're talking about mainstream publishing, not like Amazon or independent publishing. Right? Publishing is really slow, and it takes about 3 years for a novel to get out, right? And what we're talking about, like, we're not talking about the actual writing of the novel, but we're talking about the editing process, um, the proofs, the printing, the marketing, and finally getting out to the bookstores, the whole thing. And I mean, that could take much longer depending on if you started at the beginning of the writing process and you start adding the whole timeline it takes to find an agent, to get a deal, to work through the different editing passes and the proofs and all that stuff, right? So what's what Sam was saying on his post is that because of this glacial pace of the publishing industry, the novel, the contemporary novel, is way behind when it comes to being cultural commentary. So if you look at the name, the novel, right, or novella, it it's a Italian word, right, and it means new or the new thing, right, and it's not. It's no longer a very contemporary like art medium that is important to daily culture, right? Now, some of you guys are going to say, "Oh, that's not the point of the novel." Well, okay, it's not. Whatever. But we know for a fact that it no longer is, and a lot of it has to do with the glacial pace of the publishing industry. Now, you might say, "Oh, it takes a lot to do this stuff," right? But does it? All right. Let's take away the writing part, right? The actual putting down pen to paper or fingers to keyboard, right? The authorial creative process. Why does it take 2 years or so for a publishing house to get the novel out after it bought the book? Um, for comparison, your average movie, your average Hollywood blockbuster only takes about 2 years, all right, to get from the beginning of the production to the theaters. So, I was doing some quick research, kind of get some talking points, and I was looking at Lord of the Rings. It took Lord of the Rings, all three movies, 6 years from the beginning, from when Jackson started the project until the first movie was released. Right, we are talking, a series of films with like something like 20,000 costumes that were all built by hand. Um, tons of special effects, 3D special effects created in house with computer programs that were created just for that movie. Um, multiple rewritings of the scripts, on location shoots, all this stuff, right? And when you look at it in the three movies and the amount of work and stuff, it's lightning fast compared to the publication of your generic, you know 50,000 word contemporary novel, and it doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't make sense that it takes that long, and I think that's one of the main issues why it's lost its power. Now, and please comment in the chat, whoever's listening right now, or in the comments as we post this up in the future. Now, the question, right, is what is a novel, right? Well, okay, what is a book? There's a very big difference between a book and a novel, right? A book is just, you know, it's an object, right? It's a collection of papers between two covers inside and a book can be a cookbook, it can be a picture book, it can be all kinds of stuff, right? And a novel, though, is a long fictional narrative in prose form, right? You can stretch the definition and go beyond some of the 16th century work and say that you can include prose poetry like Beowulf, the French Arthurian romances, the English Arthurian romances, the whole Lancelot stuff. You can hop across the continent to China and Japan and include like the Pillow Book and multiple other um, epics written in poetic prose or poetic verse. Um, you can include like the Odyssey and all that stuff, but those are really poetic verse as opposed to literary prose. But I think when we say the novel, and we're talking about European novels, Don Quixote is probably the first European novel. And I think the modern contemporary novel would be what you could say it started with, like Robinson Crusoe is one that gets mentioned a lot. And I agree. I read Robinson Crusoe. It's very anachronistic, but at the same time, it's probably the oldest example of a novel, along with Don Quixote, right? But anyways, So all across the internet, everybody's like, the novel's dead, blah blah blah. There's no good stuff. Everything sucks and all this stuff. And I want to say yes, but right. One of the things people are saying is that, oh, everything's horrible. Every Barnes and Noble and bookstore is just romantasy novels. Okay, but those are books. They're getting published and they're getting read. All right. They are long fictional narratives that people enjoy and people are buying them. They're buying a lot of them. They're talking about them. They're making videos about them. They're doing, TikToks about them. They're making YouTube videos about them. They're having book clubs about them. So is the novel dead, or do you just not like what the novel has become? All right. And that's something that kind of bothers me, because what is the purpose of the novel? All right. Is it to entertain you? A lot of people say, I criticized fantasy writing the other day, and everybody's like, well, it's fun. It's great. Brendan Sanderson is awesome. Okay. So it's subjective entertainment. But the same people are saying, oh my God, novels are horrible. They're all woke and stupid. They're all romantic. Well, people are getting entertaining from those novels, right? Just like you're getting entertainment from Brandon Sanderson, 2,000 page, magic system slop, right? Which I find equally abhorrent as the romantasy novels. So that can't be the purpose of it if it's dead, right? So the novel can be about entertainment, but what I really think, and what I think makes a good novel, is that it is a vehicle for cultural transmission. It's a vehicle for a narrative story that tells us something about us as people and puts forth a philosophical idea. Um, it puts forth a way to look at humanity or just the culture from an artistic perspective of the author, right? And it's not just entertainment, it's more than entertainment. Can it be entertaining? Yes, but it doesn't have to be entertaining. Right? Now, so the question is then, is the artistic novel or the novel as an art form, outside of it being a consumer widget of entertainment, is it dead? I don't know. Okay. I don't know. Right. Uh, because there's so much out there that I haven't read. Right. There's so much stuff that I haven't read. And I tend to be, let me say this, right? I'm critical of writers. And let me add a caveat real fast, right? I write, I've got a novel sitting here on this computer that I hopefully will finish in the next month or two. I've published short stories under my name and other names. I've done a lot of this stuff, right? And I enjoy the art form of it. I enjoy the work of it. But there's a element that there's a element that a lot of authors, whether it's on Substack or Twitter or wherever, there seems to be a little bit of kind of sour grapes about this whole thing, right? Because what I mean is, most of you guys, and I'm going to say it right out, are functionally illiterates. Okay, you guys haven't read anything. All right, when people say, "Oh, there's nothing good to read," bullshit. All right, I have read probably close to 2,000 books in my life, and that feels so underwhelming compared to the amount of literature there is out there. You know, and I try to read through the classics and I try to add new stuff all the time. And I'm just overwhelmed. There's so much. Like right now, I've got something like 60 novels on my Kindle alone. And a few of them are like classics that I haven't got around to. And I guarantee you guys that you haven't read everything. All right. If you think you've read everything, you're full of shit. All right. Hands down. Like I name novels all the time to people and they've never read them. Half the people probably on my friend group and in the chat and stuff everywhere have never read any Dostoevsky. All right. I can give you, you can read the 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 ending trilogy of Dostoevsky, right? His like masterworks, which is Crime and Punishment, Demons, and The Brothers Karamazov. Those three novels will keep most people occupied for half a year. All right. So when people say, "Oh, there's nothing to read," no, there is a lot to read. Have you read War and Peace? Have you read Anna Karenina? Have you read all of Dickens' work? Right? Have you read, all the early 20th century work? Right? And I'm being hyperbolic here. Oh, hyperbole. Anyways, because a lot of people have read a lot of these, right? But I'll tell you right now, I have never read War and Peace. Right? It's sitting on my Kindle right now. I've read Anna Karenina, but there's so much to read. So it's not about, when people say, "Oh, the novel's dead," we're not talking about that there's nothing to read, because most people have not read everything. There's so much, right? What they're really saying is that they don't like the publishing infrastructure or the culture of reading around books, right? For Dickens, I if you like Dickens or you like British literature from the 19th century, Great Expectations is like one of the main ones. I am a really big fan of A Tale of Two Cities, and I actually think that a good book pairing to read is A Tale of Two Cities next to Dostoevsky's Demons. They go really well together because they share a lot of the same themes of, you know, but yeah, in the chat, Richard Wilson says, all novels aren't for everyone. I think you should find the classic author you like and focus on their corpus. I fully agree. All right. I think that you should find um, an author that you really love and then read all his work, and then move to the next one and read all his work, and move to the next one, read all his work. I had a summer where, I did that, where I read all of Dostoevsky, and then I moved on and I read, just a bunch of stuff. I read all of Dickens for a while. And actually, Dan Simmons writing his novel Drood was about one of the main characters in the novel was the main character of the novel Drood is actually the author Wilkie Collins and Charles Dickens himself. And it's about Charles Dickens' unfinished novel. So I had to go back and read a bunch of Charles Dickens to understand the milieu of that novel. And yeah, so, and on a quick aside, when we're talking about culture and entertainment, if you guys are familiar with the 19th century, like Western European process um, of the novel, most of the novels that we read from the 19th century, like all of Dostoevsky, all of Dickens, were actually serialized in magazines, and they weren't the main moneymaker. All right. For Charles Dickens, the main moneymaker was stage plays. As soon as he wrote a novel, it would get adapted to a stage play, and it would, that's what would make him money. And then on top of that, he would do speaking tours where he would do reading tours where he would read his novels out loud. And that's how he made money. So, in the same way, the novel to film pipeline is nothing new. It's something that existed before, film existed. Right? It was just stage plays. So if you read up on Dickens, right, almost all his novels were turned into stage plays and multi-part stage plays also, and a lot of his short stories and stuff. But that was his main moneymaker, right? His stage plays and his speaking tours and his reading tours. And he would literally just go around the world and just read out of his books and give speeches on things and talks on things. And that's how he would make money, which is very fascinating, right? So nothing is new, all right? The issues of the industry and stuff. On the topic of Dostoevsky, right? So you know how I said at the beginning that it takes about 3 years for a novel to get published here in contemporary 2026? Well, Dostoevsky wrote Crime and Punishment. He started the final writing of Crime and Punishment in 1865, in December of 1865, and it was serialized for 1 year straight. and it was finally finished in December of 1866. So it took 1 year to write and get that Crime and Punishment out to the public. Actually, less if you really start counting the monthly installments of the novel, which is wild when you think about it. So Dostoevsky and the Russian literary like publication industry could put out a masterpiece like Crime and Punishment in a year, yet it takes Simon and Schuster 2+ years to put out a 40,000 word piece of crap that nobody reads. All right. So maybe we need to re-look at the overall business models of the industry. But anyways, I digress. All right. So there's this culture, and this is I'm a millennial, and you millennial guys in listening at home or in the future probably know what I'm talking about. And I think I was listening to Dave Green talk about this, and he nailed it. He actually said exactly some of the same stuff I've been thinking. If you're a millennial, since we were little kids, we have been smacked over the head with this idea of the book, of being a reader, right? It's very important. From the time we were in elementary school, we had like, the magic school bus and books are magic, and reading became a thing, right? It was something that smart people did. Right. It was basically, if I read this, I'm smart. Or, oh, yeah, that guy reads a lot. He must be an intellectual. I got this crap my entire life. Right. I used to read a lot. I used to go to class in high school and I would sit there and just read a book instead of paying attention. Right. Oh, he's really smart. Alex is really smart. He's a reader. He reads really big books. Right. And that's a very interesting thing, because the act of reading does not make you smart. All right. Reading words on a paper does not make you an intellectual. All right. I could just be reading smut. That doesn't make me smart. It doesn't make me an intellectual. It doesn't make me have philosophical thoughts. I could just, I could be reading The Wheel of Time over and over and over. Doesn't mean I'm an intellectual. Doesn't mean there is no actual intrinsic value to reading. But right there, I know that I've probably triggered some people. All right, because we hold reading of fiction on a higher plane of value than other hobbies, right? Than other things, right? But if you were to take a guy that all he does is read, I don't know, isekai or whatever that's called, the fantasy type stuff, harem, isekai, fantasy, whatever nonsense, and this guy reads, I don't know, 100,000 page word books a week. How's that any different than a guy that spends every moment of his time like painting Warhammer miniatures? Does one have more intrinsic value than the other? Right. But we've been kind of not brainwashed, but indoctrinated into, well, I guess it's a synonym, right? But we've been indoctrinated into believing that the actual act of reading itself has a special value, right? And above that level of being a reader, right, we've been told that the act of writing itself has this magical value, right? And there's a cultural element that no longer applies in 2026. Right, so let me come back to this real fast, right? When people say that the novel is dead, right, they don't mean that nobody is writing anymore. They don't mean that nobody's publishing anymore. They don't even mean that nobody is selling, right? That nobody is selling novels, because they're still making money, guys, right? Those romantasy novels, they're still making money, right? What they're saying is that the novel is no longer a central part of our culture. All right, that's what they mean. And in that case, yes, the novel is dead. All right. Nobody talks about books anymore. All right. Nobody talks about books. Nobody sits there and has conversations about books except in esoteric, unique circles like, this podcast, the different podcast, TikToks and stuff, but nobody like sits around a coffee shop and has a conversation about books, right? Maybe, here and there, right? I can never say never because you're going to get but what if, or like me and my friends do it. Yeah, okay. But, in our parents' age, when a new novel came out, it was a cultural centerpiece and everybody talked about it. In the 19th century, everybody lined up and stood in line to get the latest Charles Dickens, chapter. Everybody lined up to get the latest Dostoevsky or Tolstoy chapter serialized. Nobody does that anymore. Okay. Nobody's like, oh, I can't wait. Or, you're never going to go to work unless you work in a library or something. And somebody's going to be like, oh man, did you read the new Cormac McCarthy? All right. No, nobody's going to do that. Okay. Maybe in rare, like unique instances, stuff like Harry Potter or some of the kind of like one-off phenomenon like of books. But for the most part, they're dead, right? So I think one of the beefs that authors have, right, that people that really want to be authors, is that they don't they're not lamenting the novel, because if you love the novel and you love writing, you're just going to write. It doesn't matter whether you sell it or you don't sell it. What a lot of people are sad about is that they it's not that the novel's dead, it's that the profession of the author is dead, if that makes sense, right? And what I mean is that in the mid 20th century up until probably the 90s, the author held a special place in a culture that maybe not valued books, but kind of made him special, right? It was like the whole Daria Morgendorfer or Lisa Simpson, or the girl that reads, the smart deep guy that likes to read, and there was a path for a writer, the sensitive man or the masculine man like Hemingway, or the drunk man, to create art. And then they would get an agent, they would get published, they would make money, and it would be like this explosion of their careers, right? If you guys are familiar with Bret Easton Ellis, right? He's a great example of probably one of the last great American authors. And by what I mean by great, I don't mean that his work is good. I think his work is great. But what I'm saying is that he's one of the last guys that made it. I mean, he was a smart kid. He was the sensitive young man from Los Angeles, ended up going to the East Coast to get his MFA, basically to get his creative writing bachelor's, I think. And I think he went to Bucknell. Well, I forgot what college he went to. Anyways, and while he was in college, he wrote Less Than Zero. He became huge. He became part of like the literary brat pack, and he was hanging out with the other authors that went to the same college, like Donna Tartt. And he was making millions, and the publishing agency was flying him around the country and around the world. And the guy made enough money to buy an apartment in Manhattan. He lived in the same building as Tom Cruise in the 90s. He was doing cocaine all day. He was partying. It was, people actually cared. They went to parties and they did cocaine and they were selling. And then, his books got made into movies. He made a crap ton of money, ended up in Hollywood, went back to Hollywood because that's where he's from. And everybody knew, everybody knows American Psycho, right? So it's one of these things where, like, the other author that had this kind of level of celebrity fame is Chuck Palahniuk, or I think I'm saying it right, Chuck Palahniuk. With Fight Club and Choke and those novels, there were still a possibility in the early 90s and mid 90s for the author to become a kind of like a rock star in a way, right? And this is like right on the heels of guys like Don DeLillo, who wrote White Noise, which is a novel I don't like whatsoever, but that's a different topic. But that was still possible. It was still possible to kind of do this, this this world of the literary superstar or even the middling superstar. On the genre side, you had Stephen King and you had George R. R. Martin, and these guys, while they did not enjoy the fun cocaine addled Manhattan parties that the literary guys did, they made a lot more money actually, probably, but they were still huge and mainstream, right? And the publishing houses took them everywhere and they bought big houses and that kind of stuff. That was a unique era for maybe about 50, 60 years that did not exist before that time, and it will not exist in the future. All right, guys. So let's just be honest here. Okay. If you're writing, you will never be Stephen King. You will never be, George R. R. Martin. It's just never going to happen. All right. The cultural infrastructure does not exist for that to happen anymore. Why? Because when Stephen King dropped the book, you could go to work, and if you worked in a middle class or above job, you'd have somebody to talk to about his latest book. All right. Nobody reads like this. You know what people read it talk about in my work? The young people. Any guesses? Video games. All right. Just yesterday, when I was thinking about what to talk about on the podcast, a bunch of my coworkers were having a conversation about Cyberpunk 2077, which is a long fictional narrative. All right. You guys get what I'm saying? It's a long video games, specifically big games like Cyberpunk or any of that stuff, are long fictional narratives, right? And they're exciting and they do new things that books no longer do. There's a level of participation in the narrative that a novel cannot really give you. So, and they're accessible to people. The novel has become a bit more esoteric, a little bit harder to get into. And because of so many choices, it's hard to pick one up because you don't know what to read. And yeah, like RPGs, right? Long narratives, that kind of stuff. I mean, what are people talking about? They're talking about long video games. They're talking about long television shows, right? I think that the nearest thing you have in the 21st century to the novel, right? Remember, the novel itself is just a long fictional narrative. It's not defined by its pages and its binding, right? It's defined by the narrative, the story, the characters inside that, right? So the real replacement for novels, in my opinion, are long form television shows, right? Things like Breaking Bad, True Detective, um, what's the one where the the Sopranos, Mad Men, right? Mad Men, right? Those are the modern 21st century equivalent of the novel, right? Because they're complex, multi-character, complex narratives, long overarching narratives. They're works of artistic art. A lot of them, you can't deny that a show like Breaking Bad doesn't compare with some of the greatest novels of all time. I mean, I would like to see somebody argue that because I think that the Breaking Bad is a Shakespearean tragedy in long form, video format. And now in the 21st century, you have video games that are doing the same thing. People will say that, oh, uh, your young kids don't have attention spans. Nonsense. That is nonsense, right? Um, I know young 20-year-olds that will sit there and play through a 40 to 60-hour game with complex narratives like Cyberpunk 2077, right? But they won't read a book. So they might have patience to read, but maybe because the books don't speak to them anymore. I don't know. So that's something to think about, right? Um, so when people say that the novel's dead, what they really mean is that the infrastructure of making them a famous writer is dead. And that's because they think that the act of writing is somehow magical and special. And you tend to get it from the same people that say, well, if you're going to be a writer, you got to write 5,000 words a day, 2,000 words a day, 5 days a week, blah, 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 It's like, shut up. All right. Shut up. All right. You can be that guy that writes 5,000 words a day for a year and puts together a 200-page novel, and it can still suck. All right. Because you have nothing to say, because it doesn't really speak to people. Right. The act of taking a pen and scribbling on a piece of paper or typing it, on a computer is not magical. All right. There is no specific intrinsic value in me typing up words. All right. It's the content that matters. It's the meaning that matters. It's the message that matters. All right. The act of typing, the act of writing, the act of even putting together a book, that's just a medium. That's all it is. Right. And when people say, well, by building up your skill, you'll get better. You can practice a sport. Like, everybody's talking about figure skating. Figure skating is a good example. All right. You can start figure skating when you're a little kid and be a really, really good technical figure skater, nail all the stuff and blah, blah, blah. But you can lack that artistic spark, right? You can lack that, that intrinsic magic that the greatest like athletes have. And you're never going to win a gold medal. You're never going to capture the imagination of people. And that's where the magic comes in, right? You'll be a good figure skater, but you'll never be one of the greats. And that applies to gymnastics or any of these kind of sports that have an artistic element to it, and definitely to writing. All right. There's, I used to play guitar. And when I played guitar, one of the things I thought was that, when we talk about guitar players, everybody's like, oh yeah, Eddie Van Halen and what's his name? Tony Iommi and the guy from Led Zeppelin, what's his name? I forgot his name. And, Kirk Hammett and Guitar Magazine and all of this stuff, right? Well, I always thought, and I think that I was proven correct with the ascent of YouTube, that the best guitar players in the world, technical speaking, was some dude in his basement, right? For every like master rock and roller or whatever, there's some nerd in his mom's basement just ripping, shredding. He's shredding the gnar over there, dude. He's playing like every scale, and he's just ripping, right? And I always used to think that, right? But they're never going to make it. They're never going to create a fantastic piece of music because while they have the technical like skill almost to an autistic level, they never have that spark. All right. Because music is more than just mastering an instrument. All right. Like no amount of technical skill will ever allow you to write and put together and perform like Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana. All right. Whether you like Nirvana or not, or the whole grunge era, it's a song and a era that defined a musical generation. It's a very simple power chord song, right? But Kurt Cobain had something that all those dudes in the basement who are just shredding on guitar, right, don't have, which is there's some kind of magic there. There's some kind of genius and able to put together very simple songs, make them pop songs, capture a zeitgeist of a generation, capture the moment of the early 90s and the disillusionment with the end of history, right? It's not technical skill. All right. So that's why I always say that, like, guys that like obsess, and when I say guys, I'm talking, multi-gender, right? Will sit there and, count words and be like, oh, I wrote 5,000 words. Say, oh, I didn't do this or I didn't do that. You're wasting your time in a way, right? That is a technical skill you're learning, which is good. But at the same time, it does not have any intrinsic value if it's not put towards art. if there's no truth in there. Because think about it this way: somebody that spends, goes to high school, writes all day, goes to college, gets his, degree in whatever, still has nothing to say, right? Because you got to go live life, because you got to be able to understand people. All right, that's the skill. In a way, writing is the hardest job. Well, it's one of the hardest art forms, that the whole point of creating stories, right? It's one of the art forms where being a little bit older, being a little bit more experienced allows you to be better, and not just technically. And that's because you have to live, right? You look at these guys, and yeah, there's a few great novels that were written by guys in their like early 20s, or even some, in 19-year-olds and stuff, right? But you need to live, you need to experience the world, and you need to have something to say about it. All right. If you don't understand people, you're never going to be a good writer. All right. Like being at a party and talking to people and having a girlfriend, having your heart broken, you know, being cheated on, living life is more valuable to you as a writer than writing 5,000 words every day. That's 100% it, right? And you guys saying travel in the chat, absolutely, but not just travel, live places. All right, you got to live. You got to be able to understand people, and you don't have to travel. All right, you can understand the people around you. You can be like a regional writer, and just by understanding the 20 people in your town or whatever, you can extrapolate that to the greater world. All right, and but you have to understand people, because character and style and everything, you have to live and you have to read. That's the two kind of things that are the most valuable thing for a writer. Technical skill, you can learn that quick. All right, it does not take a long time to master grammar, guys. It does not take a long time to master prose, in my opinion. What takes a long time is to master humanity, and that's what Dostoevsky does. All right, he understands people. If you read, Crime and Punishment, you read Demons, you read Brothers Karamazov, you're like, wow, I know that guy. All right, I know Ivan Karamazov. I know Alyosha Karamazov. I know Smerdyakov Karamazov. Well, not Karamazov, spoiler. I know all those characters. All right, I know Fyodor Karamazov because I've met bastards like that. All right, so live. All right, live, enjoy life, and try to put it down on paper, right? And let go of the bitterness that our world is different than the world of, Don DeLillo. All right. That's the key. All right, let me see what else I got here. So when I have to apologize to my fantasy bros, right? Because I said that there's no good fantasy out there. That there's no great example of fantasy. And through some friends, I came across something that I thought, in my opinion, you guys are going to be like, oh my God, what's Alex talking about? Is some of the best fantasy fiction, or, fictional narrative, let's put it that way, that I've seen since, really, I don't know, most of my life. And that's actually an anime. And that's what I did last week. I watched anime. I'm not a huge anime guy, but every now and then I'll sit around my daughter, and it's Lent. So we're not doing any screen time or video games or anything like that during Lent. But on the weekends, we're watching movies. And I was like, what are we going to watch? So I'm like, let's watch some anime. And I started watching this show called Frieren, right? It's called Frieren. And it's a fantasy. It's very typical on the nose fantasy, like very Dungeons and Dragon-esque inspired. But it's like it's hands down the best example of fantasy I've ever seen. Right? It compares in its thematic like depth to something like I'll honestly say like Lord of the Rings. And it's interesting because it is a long form fictional narrative, but it goes way deeper than that. On the surface, it's a story about a wizard, elf, and she's out there, doing stuff. But the story of it does something new and creative. It does something that has not been done before in, I think, that I've seen. I've seen like variations of it, but it does it really well. And is that it doesn't start in media res, it starts at the end of the quest. So if it was Lord of the Rings, this story for in starts as the hobbits return to the Shire. And that's where our story starts. And the catch is that this party of like a paladin kind of hero, wizard elf, which is the main character, a human priest, and a dwarf fighter warrior. They just spent the last 10 years on this massive quest to free the land of the Demon King. And they defeated the Demon King, and then now they're returned home, and everybody's celebrating. They're getting their gold, and your typical end of the quest kind of adventure. But the catch is that the elf, Frieren herself, that's her name, Frieren, she's basically functionally immortal. And she leaves the group. She's like, all right, guys, I'm leaving. I'll be back in like 50 years next time so we can watch a meteor shower together. And the show starts off with her leaving for 50 years. And there's a little montage as she's out there collecting berries and spells and stuff. She comes back to the same town. And this is where the show kind of gut punches you, is that all of her friends that she was adventuring with, that she saved the world with, are old. And the hero, the main character of the unseen quest, the one that loves her, that would be your typical male hero that loves the female wizard elf girl. Well, he dies of old age. And she realizes slowly through the show that she never paid attention to the time. To her, 10 years, 50 years were 10 years of her quest was like 1/100th of her lifespan. And she's like, oh, I'll be back in 50 years, no big deal. But she didn't realize that humans only, have a lifespan of 65 to 80 years, right? And she didn't realize how much that human interaction impacted her life, even somebody like her that's an immortal. So the whole show is basically her kind of re-stepping the original quest with some new characters now that she's kind of taken under her wing, but she's heading back towards the Demon King's castle. But this time she wants to speak to the ghost of the hero from her last quest. And there was this early on episode that made me cry, actually. It brought tears, because it captures this Japanese wistfulness that you find in a lot of Japanese literature. And it's her and her brand new human mage apprentice that she has. And they get to this village, and this old lady is polishing. She's basically upkeeping a statue. And the statue is of the hero from her first party. And it's all overgrown and kind of, falling apart. And they clean it off. And this old lady remembers them when they first passed through 50, 60 years ago. And she was a little girl at that time, but now she's, she's older, and she remembers the hero, and she remembers everybody. So she cleans off the statue, and Frieren goes, I really want to plant some flowers for him. And there's this kind of, she goes looking for a specific flower that he always talked about. And there's these flashbacks where the hero's telling her, his name is Himmel. So Himmel keeps on telling her, oh, I love these flowers. They're these beautiful blue flowers that grow in my land. And I want you to see them one day. I want you to see them. And I really love them. And she's looking for a flower so she could cast a spell to multiply it and cover the statue. And this whole time in the montage, she goes back to the initial quest, and she doesn't remember. She remembers herself not caring about the flower or anything. She's like, whatever. Why are you obsessing about this flower? But now, 60 years later, she realizes why it was important to him and why it was important to them. And there's a scene where she finally finds the flowers, And like she has this realization that like these shared moments of like beauty are really important, that it's not just a stupid flower, that it means something. And it meant something to him, and it meant something to him to have her see it. And anyways, it really touched me. I was like, man, like that's, in Orthodox religion, in Orthodox Christianity, we always talk about memory eternal and how we remember people indefinitely through their acts and because of their acts, right? And that we are we're only dead temporarily. We're only asleep in the Lord. And one day we'll be together again, right? And this show really captures that. And you have these moments. It's very like, to use a corny online term, it's a very cozy show. You know, it's not a there's action, but there's not a lot of it. A lot of it is like them finding something that reminds her of back in the day. Like there's an episode where all she does is tries to wake up in time to see a sunset that she missed 50 years before, like a special sunset over the ocean. And she didn't show up for the sunset because she was sleeping in because she didn't care. And all the rest of the party, the humans, were really upset with her. They're like, why didn't you bother waking up? Like, we were looking forward to you'd enjoy it. And 60 years later, after they're all dead, she's out there looking at the sunset, and she goes, I get it. I get what I missed. Right. And it's just this amazing, touching show about, memory and doing things and how things outlast you, and how we forget to live in the present. I think one of the greatest sins that we do as humans is we forget to live in the present. We're always obsessing about the future and what we're going to get, or we're dwelling on the past and we forget the present. And God wants us to live in the present, right? Today. That's where we are, not tomorrow and not in the past. And this show is a masterpiece. It's a work of art. And it made me eat my words from a few weeks ago when I said, oh, there's no new original exciting fantasy, because this one, if you have Netflix, it's on Netflix. I think it's also on Crunchyroll. But it's a masterpiece. It's what fantasy should be about, right? And if you guys are familiar, I don't know if any of you guys like Japanese culture, and I'm not talking about weeb culture or anything like that. I'm talking about like Japanese literature, Japanese art. There's this concept in Japan. Let me double check it real fast to tell you. Okay. So there's this concept in Japanese art called wabi-sabi. I got it right. All right. And wabi-sabi is kind of a focus on impermanence, right? That a good example, a good example in Japan would be their kind of obsession with the cherry blossoms every spring. So if you live in Japan or you're familiar with Japan, every spring they have these cherry blossom trees, and they're your stereotypical. When you see Japanese art, there's always those petals falling. Any Japanese movie has the samurai and the petals falling. Oh, they really do make a huge deal about it. When I lived in Japan, every spring it was this huge deal. Like there was apps on your phone that told you like where each like each tree was going to flower by region. So Japan's really long. It's a north to south oriented island chain, and down south in Okinawa and the tip of the mainland Japan, you have like Kyoto and stuff. It's warmer than it is up north. So the seasons kind of like trickle up the island chain. So the flowers bloom down south first, and then like a week later they're in the middle, and a week later. But there's these cherry blossom trees everywhere in parks specifically. And during the spring, they put lanterns everywhere, and people just go to look at these flowers. Oh, it's gorgeous. I'm gonna find some of the pictures I took when I lived there. And it it goes away in like 4 days. All right. That's all it is. It's like 2 to 3 days of just beautiful flower trees. And then the wind knocks them all down and they're gone. Yeah, they're on the ground and they turn brown and they're trash and they get swept away. And that really captures the idea of impermanence, right? It's a philosophical and artistic concept that's like really tied into a lot of Japanese art, which is things aren't here forever, but they do leave a spiritual, artistic impact on the observer, right? Which is what I think is really interesting, right? And the show Freeran really captures that, right? It captures the fact that like everything is impermanent, right? But it does last not through statues or like actual things, but it lasts through people, through love and the connections of people for these things, right? And I think that's a really interesting thing. And Catherine in the chat, she mentioned Murakami. Murakami absolutely in his novels captures this idea of impermanence of, in the Wind Up Bird Chronicle, there's the whole house that's falling apart and his marriage is falling apart. It's ephemeral. It's not permanent. The bird comes, the bird doesn't come. And there's all these kind of ideas of temporary, right? Like temporary life, temporary beauty. And you just have to be there. You have to be present to observe it. And the act of observation of this temporal concept is where the key to the art is, right? So to tie it into Western novels, it's important that we observe life and that we write about it. And I'm not saying we should write uh, actual like materialistic, 100% accurate observations, right? You can observe life through through fantasy, through science fiction, through all that kind of stuff. But to go back to the idea of publishing is I think, and this is not me being, I'm not a doomer at all. I'm not a downer. I actually think the novel is an art form. I think that as writers, what we need to do, and you need to do specifically, is you have to realize that the novel, right, the long fictional narrative written down to be read, right, is an art form. It itself does not matter. It's just a physical art form, right? But the story, the characters, that right, that's eternal. And we've had fictional narratives since the dawn of time, since two guys sat around, a fire and told each other stories. The medium we put it in has some effect on it, but is not the key, right? And we have to realize that. The other thing we need to realize is that the publishing industry or the world that the mid to late 20th century built around the author is not permanent. And it was an unique element that did not exist before the 20th century and most likely will not survive to the 22nd century. All right. So once we realize that, you need to realize that because it'll set you free. Right. So you have to take a step back and look at yourself and go, okay, do I want to be a writer because I love telling stories? I love humans. I love people. I have something to say, right? Or do I want to be a writer because people told me I was a smart, good girl or smart boy and that I liked reading? And if I like reading, I probably like writing. And I want to be wealthy like Stephen King and I want to go on book tours and I want people to like me and tell me how smart I am. Do you see what I mean? Right? So when people are complaining about the publishing industry, right, you have to ask yourself, are they complaining about people not reading their work? Or are they complaining about the fact that they're never going to be rich and famous and they're not going to go to Manhattan cocaine parties like Bret Easton Ellis? You know? But I think we need to kind of break the shackles of that paradigm, that mindset. One of the things that always struck me as insane, for example, in fantasy or any like short fiction writing, right, is sending out your short stories to magazines that pay like 2 cents a word or something like that, and waiting 6 months for them to give you a reply. In the 21st century, guys, that's absurd, right? Like that's absurd, right? I I did that a few times, 10, 15 years ago because I thought, that was the way to do it, right? And I realized I'm like, this is stupid. I never once like followed the instructions of like not sending I can't pronounce it. I'm tired. Of sending multiple submissions, right? All of them tell you, oh, we only accept exclusive submission. Please do not submit to. Yeah, fuck you. You want me to send you my story and wait 6 months for you to reject it, or and even if you approve it, it's like $400, right? Get out of here, man. Like that's such an absurd system, like I never once did that. Like this is stupid, and just like the whole idea of like agents and stuff. What an absurd concept when you think about it. It's an archaic, absurd concept, right? You're gonna like send your work to some dude that's like probably never gonna read it. And shut up, man. We need to break that mold, and we need to realize that this is just not how it's gonna be anymore. Okay. If you have a story to tell, tell it. And I want people to really consider maybe it might not be the proper medium anymore, right? Maybe it might not, I don't know. I mean, like I'm spitballing here. It just makes me think. It's like, is this going to be the future? Can we do serialized novels on Substack? Can we do uh, long form narrative fiction on YouTube? To take it back to Bret Easton Ellis, if his latest novel called The Shards, he actually serialized it through audio. He read every chapter during his podcast for about a year. So I've actually never read the book, but I listened to it before it was actually released. And eventually the publisher's like, yeah, it's great. So they bought it. Of course, they're going to buy his book because he's Bret Easton Ellis. But nonetheless, right, that's how he put out that novel. He put it out as a serialized podcast on his podcast. So every week he read a few chapters until the novel was done. And you do experiments like that. What you have to realize is that, like, will you write if you know for sure that nobody is going to give you $1 for it? Right? That's the question you have to ask yourself. If you say that I love writing and I have something to say, and I for a fact know that I will never get paid $1 or any amount of money for my work, will you still write? Okay. So that's I think that's the main question, right? So then the next question is, okay, we write, have novels out and that kind of stuff. What next? Well, you got to talk about it. We have to come to the fact that the form of the novel is, well, okay, so let me rewind real fast. Once you accept that the publishing world of the 20th century no longer exists, and that you need to unshackle yourself from these fantasies of Manhattan cocaine parties. I mean, shit, you can have your own cocaine party without it being in Manhattan. I can go buy some cocaine right now. I can cocaine all night by myself, right? I'll even invite you guys over if you want to, but you have to bring your own cocaine because I can't afford that much. But anyways, once you break that kind of paradigm shackle of your mind, the next step you have to ask yourself is, do I have something to say, and what are the strengths of the medium that I'm putting my art in, right? And the novel does everything better than the movie except one thing. Do you guys know what the one thing is? Car chases. Movies, you can't really write a good car chase, or any chases really. They just really don't work in novels. It kind of sucks, right? No, like you can't do an exciting car chase in a novel. I don't know, but you can do a great car chase in a film. But sex scenes are probably better in movies also. But the novel has fantastic power. Even though video games and long form television do a great job, the novel still has the ability to interiorize characters, move through time that cannot be done in any way, shape, or form in a film. It can hop between the heads of the characters. It can get into really complex, insane stuff. So when you write, you should be writing to the strengths of the medium. All right. Just like a film director, when he creates a film, he has to take into account sound and stuff like jump scares in horror movies or the buildup of suspense using lighting and sound itself. Those are elements of the medium of film. As a writer, you have to play on the strengths of the novel and do something that cannot be done in film and in video games and all the other stuff, right? So you're going to do that, right? So take those two elements and accept that, right? You're never going to become rich and famous off of it, and you shouldn't aim for, right? And you should, if you're going to write novels or short stories or poetry, write to the strengths of the medium, taking in the reality of the 21st century. All right. Because let's be honest, you talk about like Pulp Fiction, like Conan, Robert Howard, right? Excellent stuff. I love Robert Howard, right? But anime does those cool fight scenes a little bit better, right? Let's be honest. All right. Even Lovecraftian horror works a lot better in film format, in my opinion. Right. So you have to find the strengths of the actual medium itself that is not replaced by a newer, improved medium. And then you have to realize that the novel and the cultural idea of the novel and the reader is in a way going to become a niche thing. It's actually maybe it's actually probably already a niche thing, that's really been kind of propped up by the 1990s era, like mythologizing of the written word that we all got exposed to as children. So in a way, the novel is going to go the way of classical music or jazz or any of that stuff, right? Does that stuff still exist? Absolutely. Do people still write symphonies and like piano pieces? And yeah, absolutely, right? Does it have a huge cultural impact? Not so much. Not like it used to, right? So the novel might go that way. And part of that realization is that, you're writing for a smaller audience. Therefore, you should focus on a smaller audience and, you know, kind of build it, build the culture around it that you want, but realize that you might not break into the world. You might not break into the mainstream anymore, but you have the internet, and the internet allows you to communicate with people across the world. I guarantee now in the chat, there's people living all over the US and probably some Europe and probably somebody in Australia. And we're talking about this stuff. This is a power that, Dostoevsky and Dickens and Tolstoy and Jane Austen did not have. And we have it. So we're able to communicate with each other over vast distances. So let's use those tools at our disposal to build the world we want, right? So, anyways, that was it. That's it for tonight, guys. This is my cozy fireside chat. I don't have a fireplace because I live in South Carolina and it's warm all the time. And I kind of wanted to address the topic of the novel, and I really want people to stop looking at the mythology of it and when you question publishing and that kind of stuff, make sure you're questioning your reason to write versus the idea that you want to become a popular author because you want to become Brandon Sanderson or something like that, which is okay if you do, but that's not what we're going for. Anyways, thanks guys for tuning in. Please like, share, and subscribe. I'm going to post this one tomorrow when I get home from work. And I thank you guys very much for joining me. I'm going to go to bed. It's 11:10 and I got to be up at 5 o'clock tomorrow. But I'm going to try to do a bunch of these little tiny short ones so we can all chat and kind of keep up. And hopefully, I pray to God that this war thing is a nothing burger and it ends quicker, because I don't want my kid going to a war. Because the last one, I mean, it started when I was a senior in high school, and it ended when I was, I think, 38. So, yeah. All right. And absolutely, that'd be really awesome to do a meetup one day. We're talking about it. Hopefully, Fisto gets everything squared away on his end so he can join me. And then for all you guys that are Orthodox Christians, try to attend and be present at as many services as possible. We got so much, so much great stuff. I got a baptism to go to on Saturday, followed by Vespers, followed by liturgy on Sunday, and then we've got just so much. It's so much. All right. So, anyways, thank you very much for joining me. You guys have a great night, and we'll talk next time.